Hello YouTube, Dave here again. It's been a while since I've done any adventure reviews, and it's something that I really kind of wanted to get back into. Now I've got all kinds of modules and stuff like that from 3rd edition, 2nd edition, AD&D, Dragonlance, things like that. But what I really wanted to do is actually talk a little bit about one of my favorite resources when I was first getting into Dungeons & Dragons, and that is Dungeon Magazine. I used to love this magazine, and it was my favorite of the two. I mean, between Dungeon or Dragon, Dungeon was the magazine that I would go for. I collected both, but Dungeon was the one that I looked forward to every month, and Dragon was one that I figured I may as well just keep getting it since I was getting the other magazine. This magazine would have new adventures every 2 months starting off, and then it went to a monthly format after that. And with this one in particular, this actually was the start of the trend that I think really made Paizo a household name, or something that would become a big player in the tabletop role-playing game industry, and that is, this is the issue with the very first installment of the very first adventure path. This is the Shackled City adventure path, and for anyone who's not familiar, Paizo Publishing are kind of famous for their adventure paths. It's something that they've been doing with Pathfinder ever since the end of the Dungeon Magazine print run. And the very first Pathfinder products were actually adventure paths for D&D 3.5, so they didn't even have their own unique rule set yet. They were still using just regular 3.5, but the initial Pathfinder name was used, and it kind of kept Paizo going. Was just based off of the adventure path. So I thought over the course of this week I want to have a look at all the installments of the very original adventure path. Today I'm going to be looking specifically at the very first chapter because there's a lot that I kind of want to say about this one, and then we'll go through all the other chapters as the week progresses, and then I can sort of give my final thoughts on the campaign as a whole. I love campaign paths and pre-written adventures because I find them to be a lot easier to work with myself personally. And this was the very first campaign that I ever got to run from beginning all the way through to the end. So it has a very significant sentimental value to me personally. And like I said, I thought I'd go and sort of just share what this was all about, because this is an excellent, excellent campaign. So without further ado, we'll have a look at the contents of the adventure, and we'll go from there. So the very first adventure path for Dungeons & Dragons, and specifically Dungeon Magazine, was published in the March and April edition of Dungeon Magazine number 97 back in 2003. So this predates 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons. The very first few installments of this adventure path were done using D&D 3.0 rules. So this was actually, again, a pretty big deal. It's something that was never done before in the history of the magazine. I mean, there were some adventures that were sequels to one another, but there was never a dedicated campaign path that they were going to be doing from start to finish. So it was kind of a big gamble as well, because quite frankly they didn't know how successful it was going to be, and if people weren't interested in having a fully fleshed out campaign, they were dedicating initially 10 of their magazines to carrying, this adventure path. So there was definitely a risk involved, and I dare say that it paid off. But again, we'll just sort of go from the very beginning here. So the very first adventure is called Life's Bazaar and was written by Christopher Perkins. So the campaign itself takes place in the small city or large town, however you want to look at it, because it sort of changes from issue to issue, but it takes place in Cauldron. Now, Cauldron is a town built into the bowl of an extinct volcano, as far as this particular version of the adventure is concerned. You also have a cross-section here. You can see there's all kinds of natural tunnels and stuff like that that are underneath the city as well. The premise of the adventure starts off with the player characters hearing about a series of abductions or kidnappings. The most recent was 4 children from a place called the Lantern Street Orphanage. And while people have been going missing for quite some time, having these children abducted from the orphanage is kind of what spurs the adventure forward. The player characters start investigating based off of that. The initial event that takes place as the campaign begins is the player characters seeing a cleric of St. Cuthbert being accosted by a group of thugs from a thieves guild known as the Last Laugh Thieves Guild. So the player characters can kind of come in and intervene. And basically, you know, you have, they can speak with the cleric, and the cleric sort of gives them some clues, including a divination riddle. The riddle says, you know, the locks are the key to finding them. Look beyond the curtain below the cauldron, but beware the doors with teeth. Descend into the Malachite hold, where precious life is bought with gold. Half a dwarf binds them, but not for long. So it's, you know, again, a really cool thing, and the player characters have to do some investigation at this point. They can go to the orphanage, they can speak to a bunch of other NPCs, go into the temples, they meet up with a mystery group known as the Striders of Farlangen, and their motivations aren't quite clear at this point in time, but they can be beneficial NPCs that can help the player characters out quite a bit. Eventually, the player characters find out that all of the locks that have belonged to the homes or the orphanage of people who have been taken were all made at Gelv's Locks, which is a singular location run by a gnome by the name of Keegan Gelv. Keegan Gelv is being blackmailed into providing master keys or skeleton keys to all the locks that he's created because he is actually a beginning or novice illusionist, and his familiar was kidnapped by these creatures known as Dark Creepers and Dark Ones, and they're basically, you know, blackmailing him with his familiar's life in order to help them, you know, kidnap these people. The player characters can go to Gelv's Locks, and they eventually discover a secret entrance that takes them from the locks to a place known as Zitterune. Now this is a Gnomish Enclave, and just look at that. There is a lot of stuff going on in this particular place. Now the player characters can explore this location, and really there's a lot of rooms here. I mean, there's 63 unique areas to explore in this one map alone. Now the actual the actual captives or the kidnapping victims are not located in Zitterune, but the player characters really don't have much of a way of knowing that. They have to make their way through the dungeon, through the enclave, and find their way to an elevator that leads to the Malachite Fortress. Now what's kind of interesting about Zitterune is the Gnomish Enclave has been long abandoned. The history behind it is that there was a magical disease known as the Vanishing that started to overtake this Gnomish Enclave. And what it did is it infected any magic items created within Zitterune. Anyone that would use them would slowly start having their charisma drained, and as this happened they would become more and more transparent until their charisma reached 0 and they just vanished from all existence. So this infected all the magic items that were created in this enclave, and you know, the player characters can learn this. They can find out about, you know, the plague and everything else. So what it does is it means that basically any magic item that the player characters find in the 63 rooms that they can explore, they're probably going to pass on because they don't want to run the risk of being cursed. After going through the Gnomish Enclave and fighting all the things there, including some grells, skulks, dark creepers, you know, hammerers and pulverizers, ragamuffins, which we've got, you know, sort of an example of here, they can finally make their way down to the Malachite Fortress. There's a pulverizer, which is, if anyone's not aware, there was a miniatures game for Dungeons & Dragons put out in 2002 called Chainmail. And Chainmail used, like, pewter figures, and the human faction had access to these automatons, which were unreliable. They actually had a trait that you had to roll a d20, and I think if you got an 11 or higher, then they were able to act that turn. Otherwise, it was just a waste of an activation. So they actually have them in this as well. You got hammerers and pulverizers, and then finally, when you reach the elevator shaft, the players can make their way down to the Malachite Fortress. Now, this is where all the captives are currently being held. There's some interesting encounters in here as well, such as an encounter with an ogre in a room filled with like waste and refuse, and this ogre is actually a polymorphed Otyug, which was kind of a cool encounter to have. The player characters can also find some mimics throughout Zitaroon and in the Malachite Fortress as well. The one that they find in Zitaroon is actually neutral and will talk to the player characters, isn't actually necessarily aggressive, but the one in the Malachite Fortress is very much aggressive. The characters can rescue quite a few of the kidnapped victims in this adventure, and finally what they come to is a location known as Kazmojan's Bazaar. Now, Kazmojan is a half-dwarf, I think he's a half-fiend, if I recall correctly. Let's see if I can just find his stats here. It's been a little while. Sorry, half-troll. So he's a half-dwarf, half-troll. And he is, when the player characters arrive, he's actually auctioning off one of the children. So as the fight breaks out, the player characters, can engage Kazmojan as well as the buyer, which is a Durzagon, which is sort of like a fiendish dwarf. And as the fight takes place, you actually have a beholder that just teleports into the middle of the room. And here's the description here. It just says, suddenly an enormous spherical creature appears in the middle of the room. It has a stony hide and a large central eye, a toothy maw, and a crown of writhing eye stalks. It fixes its many eyes on you and begins to speak in common. And it says, I have come for Tarim Kratis. I don't know how to pronounce that. The boy should not have been taken from Cauldron. I intend to see that he is safely returned to the orphanage. You can keep the others. They are of no consequence. Come, Tarim, you'll be safe. So, at this point, most likely what's going to happen is that the boy is going to go with the Beholder, the fight can continue, and when the characters arrive back in Cauldron, after going through all of this and rescuing all the captive slaves, they discover that the boy, Tarim, has been safely returned to the orphanage. But there's a few questions that kind of remain. Like, first of all, why is this boy so important? Why would a beholder be looking to rescue him? And we're going to get more into the actual overall story as the campaign progresses. So I don't want to give away too much right now, but that's basically what happens in the first adventure. So that's the overall premise. The player characters are investigating a series of kidnappings. They get to explore 2 sets of ruins underneath the city of the small city or large town of Cauldron, and they manage to rescue most of them, disrupt the slaver ring, make it safe for all the citizens, because they would have dealt with the Dark Creepers, and if they hadn't, then the Dark Creepers likely abandon the Cauldron region, and they kind of save the day and become something of a set of small heroes. So that's, like I said, that's the overall premise of the first adventure. And that's kind of what happens. And like I said, I'll go over the finer points of the story later on, because this kind of just sets up a few things, but wants to keep as much stuff as possible a mystery. So I'll save the rest of the exposition and why Tarim is so important for a later adventure. But now I just want to kind of give a few of my just final thoughts on this particular adventure itself. Alright, so that was Chapter 1, Life's Bazaar. This is the very first installment of the very first adventure path that Paizo Publishing had ever done. It was written by Christopher Perkins, and overall it's a pretty good adventure, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily perfect by any stretch of the imagination. On the positive sides, having the player characters investigate the kidnappings in the beginning is actually quite a bit of fun. When I ran this for my group, they actually really enjoyed going from location to location and speaking with different people, trying to gather as much as they can. Going to the orphanage, discovering that the half-orc janitor is actually working with the Last Laugh Guild was kind of a big moment. They actually managed to discover that before, finding and intimidating him into letting them know what was kind of going on, and going to, Gelb's locks, rescuing Keegan Gelb's familiar, and getting him to change the locks into all of the homes that he had previously installed them in, just to, again, make them safe. So there's a lot of really cool stuff. The idea of the slavers market was, again, actually pretty cool, and the concept behind Zitaroon, the Gnomish Enclave, is, again, very, very interesting. So what are the downsides of this particular adventure? The biggest downside is there's just way too much stuff for the player characters to do for first level characters. I mean, this is an adventure for first level characters, and they're only meant to reach third level at the very conclusion of this particular adventure. So when they defeat Casmogin and disrupt his slave trading ring, that's when they gained third level. So going through Zitterune, this big Gnomish Enclave with 63 rooms in it, they're going to be first level throughout a lot of it. Now, of those 63 rooms, nearly half of them are empty of any encounters, but there's still lots of traps in the Enclave itself. The Gnomish Enclave of Zitterune has like pit traps, it has curse traps, it's got all kinds of different things going on. And again, it's a really cool location, but it serves absolutely no purpose for the adventure itself. I mean, the player characters really could have just gone from Gelv's Lock straight into the Malachite Fortress and not have missed anything. You know, the only thing that they would have gotten was some experience points for going through Zitterune. And it's a bit of a shame because it's such a cool location with some like illusory rooms with like, you know, has like a forest in one room and it feels like they're actually in a forest. There's got the Gnomish throne where, you know, the player characters can, in order to speak with the king, they have to leave an offering of a particular, you know, value coin. And if they don't, then they get cursed with clumsiness and have their dexterity affected. It's really cool. I mean, when I was running the Zitterune encounters, I actually had one of my players continuously set off the traps. And, you know, intentionally when they were told to leave an offering for the king, the other characters put a gold piece in this, you know, this place where you can put these offerings, and he intentionally put a copper piece in and got cursed and had his dexterity affected. So it's cool, but again, it's padding. And the reason I think for it is the initial idea behind the adventure path for Dungeon Magazine was that Dungeon Magazine was a bi-monthly publication. And they were only going to, even though the second installment from that point forward became a monthly magazine, they were still only going to be publishing the adventures once every 2 months, or sometimes even 3 or 4 months when in between installments. So, knowing that it's going to be at least 2 months before your next chapter, they wanted to give lots and lots of stuff for the players to do, so that by the time they've completed this adventure, it would be around the time that the next installment was coming out. And that's okay, but again, you're making them go through this large 63-room location, knowing that they're looking for missing people, so they're going to want to explore all of it and not leave any of it leaving no door unopened sort of thing, because what if some of these kidnapped victims are actually held in this enclave? So you're getting them to go through an awful lot. And again, you know, with 63 rooms, that's a lot in of itself, and then the Malachite Fortress has 30 some odd rooms to it as well. So you're getting almost 100 rooms to explore, which is just, in my opinion, way too much for a group of first level characters. And that's sort of the problem, is that they're, you know, at most going to be second level up until the very end of the adventure itself. So they're not going to have a lot of resources. I mean, if you're playing an arcane spellcaster, you know, for most of the adventure, at most you're going to have 2 spells. And once those 2 spells are gone, either the whole group has to leave the dungeon, or you have to try to find a safe room in, you know, like the Gnomish Enclave, for example, to rest and regain those spells, or else your wizard character is essentially useless. They've got, you know, maybe 6-7 hit points maximum, unless they have a wizard with an 18 constitution, which I'd be kind of surprised if they ever did that. So yeah, that's a bit of an issue. And the other problem is the Zitterune with the vanishing, and even though the vanishing is really cool and could have made for some interesting moments later on in the campaign, which, spoiler alerts, it doesn't, it's got a whole bunch of magic items that the player characters are going to be afraid to touch. So even though they're grinding through all of these rooms and going through all of these encounters, some of which are actually pretty difficult for a group of first level characters. I mean, the Ragamuffins have a decent amount of hit points. You've got the Grells, which have a decent amount of hit points. It's going to be a very much a battle of attrition for the player characters as they're going through this. And their reward for exploring these 63 rooms is treasure that they're not going to want to touch. So I think that there were better ways to sort of go about, doing this first part. I would have actually just eliminated the Zitterune altogether and try to find a way to incorporate it later on in the campaign and have it be a way that sort of, makes sense, or try to tie it to the overall story. Setting up the mystery of why this one particular orphan is so important is actually a really cool moment, and the player characters, when I ran it, were pretty scared of having a beholder appear in the middle of the room, and they're only second level at this point, so it was one of those sort of crap your pants moments. And they just, like, we can't do anything here, so, take the boy sort of thing. So it was a really, really cool moment, and beholders are my favorite monsters, so for me that was sort of a big thing. Overall, this is actually a pretty interesting first installment. Now, one of the big things about the original adventure path is Paizo, however you want to pronounce it, they were not at all sure about how this was going to work out. So the very first adventure path, the design premise behind it was that each of the adventures had to be able to stand on their own instead of being, this strongly interconnected series of adventures. Each adventure needed to be strong enough on its own that if people just wanted to run it for that particular chapter, then they could do so without feeling like they're missing anything or feeling like they're requiring too much prior knowledge of other events in order to do what needs to be done in the particular adventure. And this is very much a standalone adventure. It does leave a few things open, like, again, who is this boy? Why is he so important? Why does this beholder want him, and why did this beholder rescue him and actually return him without any issues? Now, the beholder didn't actually return the boy. It was some mysterious woman that had like a veil over her face and stuff. But again, the adventure is very much self-contained. There's room for investigation, there's some mystery, but the overall story that this adventure wanted to tell is wrapped up within that adventure. Now again, I really do love this particular campaign path, and there's a lot of good things about the first installment. The only issue really is the amount of extra padding that's in here. So if I were to run this again, I would drop Zitterune either altogether, or I would make it so that they couldn't access certain rooms at that point in time, and have a more direct path that they can take to get to the Malachite Fortress. It's just the way that I would do it. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed, and let me know in the comments below. Did you ever run Life's Bazaar? Did you run or play through the Shackled City Adventure Path? And what were your thoughts? Try to keep it to just your thoughts on the first chapter in this video, because I will be talking about the overall storyline later on, as well as reviewing all the rest of the adventures that were released as part of this. There are 11 adventures altogether, so 11 magazines had installments of the Shackled City Adventures in them. So tomorrow's video, I'm actually going to rapidly go through the next 3 chapters, so chapter 2, 3, and 4. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Did you play it? Did you enjoy it? What are some of your memories from it? Did you have, like, say, a wizard set off a bookshelf trap because they just realized that they needed spell books and push the rogue out of the way, even though he wasn't able to fully detect traps yet, just to pull on a book and have everything collapse on them? Let me know, because that's something that did happen in the adventure that I ran. So thank you guys again very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.